Our guest on this edition of CityWide is the Honorable Ann Pfau. She's the Chief Administrative Judge of New York State Courts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, how big is the New York State court system?
Well, it's big. We are the third branch of government in New York State. There's the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And in New York, the judiciary is part of one system, and that's the New York State Judiciary. We have 1,200 judges, 350 buildings, and about 15,000 non-judicial employees.
And how big is your budget?
Our budget is about $2.6 billion.
Wow.
So we are, all of the courts in the state, except for the federal courts, are part of the same system. So whether you're in housing court, whether you're in Supreme Court, or in the appellate courts, it's part of the New York State Judiciary.
I don't imagine there are too many people who go to law school thinking that they want to wind up as the chief administrative judge, and I suspect even most judges, when they go on the bench, aren't thinking about that. How did you wind up in this position?
And right now, there aren't a lot of judges who want to be the chief administrative judge, that's for sure. I went to law school, like a lot of people, thinking I would be a lawyer, and I ended up working as a lawyer for the judiciary, because it was a time when you were a woman with children, and that, public sector was a little easier to work with. And I was just fortunate to become a judge and be able to sit and do work starting in criminal court, and just like the administrative side of it, and kind of doing both, sitting in court and doing administration. And when my predecessor, Judge Lippman, went to become the presiding judge in the appellate division, then Chief Judge Judith Kaye made me the chief administrative judge.
This was not a happy budget season for the courts. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened and what's the real world impact of it?
Well, you have to think of our court system, just how big it is. We have every year 4.7 million cases get filed in New York State.
That's new cases filed every year.
New cases filed, so probably about the biggest in the country. And that's, again, all the way from housing court issues to the top of the Court of Appeals. So we've got a lot of people using our courts, and I will say these days with the economy, we really, really are the emergency room for society. That families that are facing crisis, you could have a family whose house is in foreclosure, they have a consumer credit problem in civil court, they have a family emergency in family court, they might be going through a divorce in Supreme Court. So more and more people are coming to our courts these days, and the cases are much more complex than usual. And we are trying to keep up with this. We have a very limited amount of judges, and one thing most people don't understand is the number of judges is set by statute or by Constitution. So it's not easy.
You can't go out and hire 10 more
We can't
judges.
add judges to meet the caseloads. And so more and more we ask people who aren't judges to do more support work. Judges are working harder and harder than ever. And this year we, like everybody else in New York, has to share the pain as far as the amount of resources we have. So we are trying to address this burgeoning caseload, give people what they need, which are sometimes emergency orders, protection in the middle of the night, really try to be the emergency room that we are, but do it within a very finite, number of resources that we have this year.
There are a number of things that the courts have done to make the experience more palatable. Most people are not in the courthouse because they want to be. But there have been some real improvements in terms of facilities for jurors and for children and things. Could you talk about some of those improvements and also what the budget's going to be?
Yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, the things that are happening with budget are things that citizens are going to feel, and we are trying to reduce that, but it is going to be a reality. And I think really when Judge Kaye came in as the chief judge, in 1993, she really started everybody thinking differently about, we are the people's courts. It is the taxpayers for whom we work every day, and that the experience had to be as positive as possible, whether you're a juror or these days more and more if you're a litigant who can't afford a lawyer. Are trying to make the experience as user-friendly as possible and as convenient as possible. So we have tried to do a lot of things, from making sure that if jurors come, they actually get used, because that's the biggest complaint by jurors, they come and sit around. So if you are not called in one day, you shouldn't have to repeat that the next day. We call it one day, one trial. You get picked for one trial or you serve for one day. So we try to reduce the jury experience. For families coming to family court, particularly more and more, we have been providing child care centers where it does many things. It not only keeps the child out of the courtroom so they don't hear things they shouldn't hear, so that the court can run more efficiently, but it's a perfect place to hook needy families up with services. And we think of this in the New York City context, which is very true, but we have some very, very rural upstate counties where the only social service interaction the families have is in the courtroom. It really is the hub of the community.
For many people, the landlord and tenant court, the civil court, the family court, the criminal court, the lower rung of the judicial system is the only experience that they have. But you'll walk into those buildings and it doesn't convey a message that justice is majestic. Is there any hopes that that's ever going to get addressed?
And it's so much better than it was.
Yeah, it's so much better than it was.
I mean, it's always a work in progress. And I will say in New York City, because in our silly system, the facilities are actually owned by the locality. So here it's New York City, and they have done a wonderful job of thinking through facilities plans to improve the facilities, and they actually have done a great deal. It is very, very hard to keep up with the volume that we have. To keep facilities clean is an ongoing issue because there are just so many people who use our facilities. And to have a building that's going to keep up with the size of the caseload growth and the number of people who use the building is always a challenge. So it is a work in progress.
Now, you mentioned the impact that the recession's had in terms of the kinds of cases that are coming in.
Yeah.
Crime is way down in New York. What's been the impact on the sort of the criminal side?
Well, felonies are down. Interestingly, arrests are not down. So, and that's, for us citizens, that's terrific because the streets are safe and that's what we want. So we are seeing a somewhat drop in felonies, and I think you're right, serious crimes are down, but not any kind of comparable drop in misdemeanors. So more and more people are being arrested, being brought in for arraignment. All those cases are continuing. And since we can't produce more judges, often what we do is, if there is a place where we don't need judges necessarily as much, we move those judges, let's say, to family court, where filings are up and we do need them.
But in this, I know for a lot of viewers this is going to be confusing, but there are these different tiers of courts, and some are elected and some are appointed, and you can move some people from one place to another, but it's not like everybody's got the same rank. Right. And you can just deploy them when you need them. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
It is a little bit of a crazy system, partly because New York makes it very complicated. We have in New York, just at the trial court level, 7 different levels of courts. It's a little bit ridiculous, and certainly if you look down the road, it's something that would be very helpful. A constitutional amendment to simplify the trial court system would really be a wonderful thing and very helpful to New Yorkers. But you do have, just within New York City, you have family court judges who are appointed by the mayor, you have civil court judges who are elected, you have criminal court judges appointed by the mayor, you have Supreme Court judges who are elected.
And the mayor fills the vacancy for civil court judges?
Only for the rest of that year.
And then the governor fills the vacancy for Supreme Court judges, and then the governor can appoint Court of Claims judges who considers Supreme Court judges.
It is very much of a crazy quilt system that we try to manage as best as possible to put the judges in the courts where they are needed the most without going outside what really is their jurisdiction.
So what prevents the consolidation? It's got to be some kind of politics. It needs the state legislature, but it's hard to imagine who benefits from this.
It's one of those things. I mean, we are the third branch of government, not the first or the second. And if you went to the person on the street to say, what's your #1 governmental priority? Simplifying the court system isn't going to be that. It's a hidden issue that would benefit New Yorkers greatly, but it's not particularly visible for somebody to say, that's my issue and that's what I want to spend my political capital on.
Let me give an example of that. Not directly relevant in the city of New York, but many of us read the series that Bill Glaberson did for the New York Times a year or two ago about justice in the town courts and the village courts, where you had, in many cases, non-lawyers acting as the judge, and where their procedures seemed to be informal to the point of impinging on people's constitutional rights. Has anything changed since then?
I hope so. We have, I mean, that series of articles and all of the work that was done after that really did propel us to look at this, because while the town and village courts are outside of New York City and they're not really part of our system, we are responsible for their education. We want to make sure they work right. And yes, you can walk, and I have done this, you can walk in at midnight to a town and village court or a village court, and it's in the barn, and right outside the door before you walk in the courtroom is the axe hanging on the barn door, and you know, you don't exactly feel like you're getting justice. So we have worked with the Magistrates Association, it's what they're called, to make sure that there is certainly a level of education that is required, that one can't sit as a judge without meeting that educational minimum. We provide resources through grants to enhance the facilities, to provide, hopefully provide more dignity to the facilities. It is something that I think everybody now is certainly very aware of. But the issue of having non-lawyer judges is a reality as long as you have the town and village system, because not every village has a lawyer who's willing to run and be judge.
I think we're going to take a break now.
Great.
CityWide will continue right after this. You know, when we look at the statue of justice, people always focus on the blindfold that she's wearing. But in this episode, we're really talking about how we keep that scale balanced. CityWide will continue right after this.
I'm lucky. Let me help you with that. I get to do something I love. It has nothing to do with touchdowns or titles.
Everybody bring it in.
I get to play a part in the life of someone just starting out.
How many of you think homework is just as important as teamwork?
I help keep kids in school.
Good.
And that's the name of the game.
My name is LaDainian Thomason. I don't just wear the shirt, I live it.
Give, advocate, volunteer. Live United.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Chief Administrative Judge Ann Pfau. How do you hold judges accountable? Not necessarily for the rightness or wrongness of their decision. That's a professional reputation issue. But in terms of their productivity.
You know, it's hard. Judges are independently elected or appointed. They have their caseloads and they manage their own caseloads. I think a couple of things. One, most judges I know take great pride in doing the great work that they do, and they do it marvelously. Like any other group, there is certainly, you know, any number that we have to move along. And I think it's a combination of, one of the things we try very hard to do is match the right judge with the right assignment. A judge may do a great job with commercial cases, but not do such a great job with divorce cases. So you try to make sure the cases they get are the ones they can handle. And then at the end of the day, you do what you do as any other manager. You know, you prod, you move along, you try to make sure they're in a place they like, or threaten that maybe they go to a place that they don't like.
Are there statistics that you watch for their
Absolutely.
productivity?
We watch statistics all the time. We look at a number of things. How many new cases are coming in, how long it's taking to resolve a case is very, very important, and that we watch, and there are national standards for that, and there are standards that we certainly look at. And, you know, I hope it continues. People complain a lot and let me know when there are problems with judges, and that's very, very helpful. And we have a system where the judge's supervisor sits with them several times a year and really has a heart-to-heart with them as to...
yeah, and those views get factored in by bar associations and things when
Exactly.
judges come up for renewal
Exactly.
on
Exactly.
their terms. Now, the federal courts operate differently. If you're a federal judge, you could get a drug case 1 minute and a securities case another minute. They would argue that it makes them more well-rounded, but here we have more specialists.
It would be wonderful to have a system where you could do that. We have in the state courts more cases filed in one day than all of the federal courts in the country get in 1 year.
Say that one more time.
More cases are filed in the New York state courts in one day than all of the federal courts in the country combined for a year.
Wow.
So we don't have the luxury of having that kind of mixed caseload, which of course I think judges intellectually would enjoy. You have to build in efficiencies, and remember there are a lot of participants in this. It's not just the judge. You know, there are the lawyers who appear, there are institutional lawyers who appear, there are social service providers in family court, and to the extent that they have to do a lot of moving around, it's less efficient. So you really have to think of the whole big system and how you're going to manage all these cases and try to get things done, because at the end of the day, we can never ever forget that in family court there's a family in distress, that you have to have some resolution of what's going on with them.
Well, some people suggest, and certainly that given the volume and the special training, if you will, that you need to handle, say, a medical malpractice case, but some people argue that the specialized parts, familiarity can lead to integrity issues. And it also often comes up where there are issues that are hard to reduce the math, a matrimonial case, right, for example. In your own experience, you were appointed the administrative judge in Brooklyn.
Yes.
The Clubhouse gang referred to that as the Brooklyn court being put into receivership. Yes. And in fact, there was a corruption scandal that, yes, kind of erupted out of the matrimonial part.
Right.
So how did that make you feel, and what do you do to prevent that kind of, you know, alleged outright corruption?
Boy, that was, I loved being in Brooklyn. I hated that part of it because it was the last thing I expected, quite frankly. And I would say that you can't ever just rest on your laurels. And I will say this in hindsight, if you have people who are really insistent on staying where they are, don't move me, whatever you do, don't move me, maybe you better move them and see if there's a problem. So I think we learned a lot from that. We do rotations. We do make sure that there's staff rotations as well as judge rotations. I think you just have to keep mixing it up and making sure that, again, the tone always comes from the top. So whoever the administrative judge is in the court, to me that's the most important job in the system. They set the tone. They look under, you know, the chairs to see what's going on. They make sure that everybody understands what that integrity standard is.
Now, lest anybody think that I'm picking on the Brooklyn courts, Brooklyn also has pioneered some very special experiments, I think, that have been adopted nationally. The domestic violence part, Judge Leventhal, and some of the drug courts, community court in Red Hook. How does information about well, let me ask you two questions. One is, what makes these parts special and different from what anybody else is doing? And then how does that get scaled up? How does it grow? Or is it just, these are good ideas, but there's no real mechanism for instituting them elsewhere?
Well, that's really always been the question, and I think drug court's the perfect example. And of course, it all started in Brooklyn because you have a very innovative district attorney who's willing to try things. You've got the volume, so you can really make things happen because you've got a lot of cases. And, you know, going back to our prior conversation, you have wonderful, wonderful judges in Brooklyn that are really willing to try different things and very, you know, very smart, very interested in what they are doing. And drug courts now are in every county in the state. It is institutionalized, really, you know, Rockefeller drug revision helped us enormously in that. But there is not a court in the state on the criminal side where you don't have access to the kinds of things that are in drug court. The availability of counseling, the judge holding the person accountable, that has been brought to scale in ways that are really very cost effective.
Is technology changing in the courts?
Not fast enough. It has got to be our answer to the future as to how we move forward. You know, if you go in with me to a county clerk's office, and I'm sure you do, you know, you still are taking volumes of paper like this, putting it through the window, getting a receipt. You know, I was at the appellate divisions recently, and just these huge carts of paper comes in. We have to move beyond those days. Electronic filing, which is in some locations, has got to be the wave of the future. It's the way we have to go. On the criminal side, there are very limited instances in which we can have appearances electronically by defendants. all of that, I think, is going to change and is the kind of efficiency we have to build into our system.
And maybe some kind of airline reservation system so that lawyers can check in on cases and...
We have that in family court.
Right. So if you need an adjournment, you don't have to go down there and wait for 3 hours, to stand up and say, put it off.
And you can check in electronically. We actually have that in family court so the judge knows where you are, so if they need to find you, we are starting down that road.
What would you say is excellent? An awful lot of people who get caught up in the justice system, one form or other, you alluded to this earlier, don't have lawyers.
Right.
And that obviously puts them at a huge disadvantage in the case itself, but it also makes it harder to administer the system.
Absolutely.
I know that that's become a priority for Judge Lippman, but is there any realistic prospect that that need is going to get met in any significant way?
Well, the need is huge, and the need is growing. The Chief Judge established a task force to really try to quantify that need. And, I think the number they use is about 20% of the civil legal service needs are being met now. And that's enormous, and we feel it every single day. And it always has been in places like housing court that that's the case, but now you come to Supreme Court. I can tell you as a judge, the cases I have, probably 20% increase in the number of people in a commercial case that are representing themselves because people just can't afford lawyers. We have funding in our budget for the first time, in the judiciary budget, to start the process for providing civil legal services for the essential needs of families. And the things we're hoping to be able to start to address, and it's really just a first step, are foreclosures, where the imbalance is just extraordinary between the bank and the homeowner. Evictions, the kinds of things, family needs, all of those very basic things. We're starting to walk down that path, but we have a very long way to go.
So if you were going to sort of sum up where the courts are, where you think they'll be going in the next couple of years, given these budget constraints, the fact that the system is so opaque to so many people until they're caught up with it, what's the one thing you'd want our viewers to take away from this show?
That for all of the things people hear about the courts, all of us in state court, we are the people's courts and we work for the people. And everything we try to do, to help the community, to reach out to the community, to include the community, have the community have trust in the justice system. Fundamentally, we're built on trust. If the community and the people don't trust the justice system, then we're not doing our jobs. So we are trying to move in that direction, like everybody else, with fewer resources, without the kind of glitz and glamour that goes maybe with some other branches of government, but to have people walking through our doors thinking this is a place I can get justice and I can trust.
My thanks to the Honorable Ann Pfau. She's the Chief Administrative Judge of New York State Courts. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide.